communication didn't stop. It just stopped meaning anything. There's a specific kind of ending that never announces itself. No argument, no accusation, no final message that draws a line. Instead, what happens is far quieter and far more disorienting. The relationship begins to thin. Not through silence, but through something worse. Shallow continuity. Messages still arrive. Responses still come. But somewhere beneath the surface, the emotional behavior that once held everything together has fundamentally shifted. And by the time it becomes impossible to ignore, the distance has already been growing for weeks, maybe months. This is where relationship psychology reveals one of its harshest truths. People don't always leave by walking away. Sometimes they leave while still responding. They stay in the structure while withdrawing from the substance. And because the withdrawal happens gradually, in small, seemingly reasonable increments, it becomes almost impossible to pinpoint when things actually changed. There's no single moment to look back on. Just a slow erosion of presence that reshaped everything without ever making noise. Behavioral patterns like these don't operate through drama. They operate through consistency, the kind that teaches you over time that someone is no longer emotionally available, even though they're still technically there. What makes this particular form of emotional distance so destabilizing is that it lives in the gray space between connection and rupture. Attachment patterns don't always break cleanly. Sometimes they fray. The person pulling away might not even recognize what they're doing. They're just busy, just tired, just not as responsive as they used to be. But when those justifications repeat week after week, they stop being explanations and start being evidence. Evidence that the psychological dynamics holding the relationship together have quietly come undone. Evidence that what you're experiencing isn't a rough patch, it's a structural shift. This isn't about blame. It's not about labeling anyone as the villain or the victim. It's about understanding how emotional withdrawal actually works when it's not loud. How behavior analysis becomes essential when words still sound right, but actions have gone cold. How the thinning of communication, not its absence, but its gradual loss of depth, becomes the clearest signal that intimacy has already left the room. What follows is an investigation, not of what was said, but of what stopped happening. Not of the moments that hurt, but of the patterns that reveal the truth long before anyone is ready to speak it. There's no fight, no accusation, no door slammed shut. What happens instead is far quieter. A slow, almost invisible contraction in the volume of words exchanged. The relationship doesn't announce its shift. It simply begins to breathe differently. Conversations that once flowed without effort now require a small push to begin. Messages that used to come naturally now feel slightly delayed, as if passing through a new filter neither person acknowledges. This is where emotional behavior starts to rewire itself beneath the surface, long before anyone admits something has changed. It's easy to dismiss at first. Life gets busy. People get tired. Schedules don't always align. These explanations are true enough on their own, but they miss the larger pattern forming just out of view. What defines this stage isn't the content of what's said. It's the gradual reduction in frequency, the thinning of texture. Relationship psychology doesn't always operate through dramatic events. Sometimes it operates through absence, through what stops happening, through the small, repeated withdrawals that never get named because they never feel large enough to justify concern. The person on the receiving end often feels it before they can explain it. There's a faint sense that something is off, but nothing concrete to point to. No missed call feels like proof. No delayed text feels like evidence. And yet the accumulation of these minor gaps begins to form a shape. Attachment patterns don't require cruelty to shift. They only require consistency to falter. When emotional distance grows without explanation, the mind begins scanning for reasons, for mistakes, for something to pin it on. But the truth is simpler and harder to face. The behavior itself is the message. This is the stage where denial still works, where both people can pretend nothing has fundamentally changed. But beneath that surface agreement, something else is already in motion. The psychological dynamics of connection are beginning to thin, and neither person is quite ready to name it. What comes next isn't louder. It's quieter still. And that's where the real pattern begins to show itself. Not in what's said, but in how long it takes to say anything at all. The delays start showing up with explanations attached. Work ran late. Phone died. Didn't see the notification. Each reason sounds plausible on its own, and maybe some of them are. But what matters isn't whether the excuses are true. It's that they've become necessary in the first place. When someone consistently needs to justify why they didn't respond, the relationship has already crossed into different territory. Emotional withdrawal doesn't always look like disappearance. Sometimes it looks like apologizing for being present too slowly. This is where behavior analysis becomes essential, because the content of the response often distracts from its timing. The message itself might still be warm, engaged, even affectionate, but it arrives hours later than it used to. The gap isn't dramatic enough to call out, but it's wide enough to feel. And over time, that gap becomes part of the new rhythm. What once felt like connection now feels like maintenance. The other person is still responding, still participating, but something about the energy has shifted. They're no longer leaning in. They're catching up. Relationship patterns don't announce themselves through grand gestures. They reveal themselves through micro-adjustments in effort and availability. When someone begins consistently arriving late to conversations they used to prioritize, it's not usually about the circumstances they cite. It's about where their attention has quietly relocated. Attachment behaviors operate on a spectrum, and one of the earliest signs of detachment is the slow erosion of immediacy. The person is still there, but they're no longer close. And because they're still technically responding, it becomes easy to rationalize the distance as temporary. The one waiting starts adapting without realizing it. They stop expecting quick replies. They preemptively lower their own investment to match what's being returned. This is how emotional behavior recalibrates itself. Not through confrontation, but through quiet adjustment. And in that space between sending and receiving, something begins to settle. A new understanding that hasn't been spoken yet. That the rhythm they once shared is no longer something both people are actively protecting. What happens next isn't faster, it's slower still. The imbalance doesn't declare itself all at once. It builds through small, repeated moments where one person initiates and the other follows, but not quite at the same pace. Conversations that used to flow back and forth now move in bursts, with longer silences in between. The pauses feel normal enough individually, but together they form a pattern that's harder to ignore. This is where relationship dynamics begin to show their structural cracks. Not through absence, but through irregularity. Through the feeling that something once synchronized has quietly gone out of time. These accumulated pauses create a strange kind of tension. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that lingers. The person reaching out starts to notice they're doing it more often. The person pulling back might not even realize they've shifted their positioning. They're not avoiding, they're just less available, less immediate, less interested in maintaining the tempo that used to exist without effort. Psychological dynamics like these operate beneath conscious awareness most of the time. They're felt before they're understood. And by the time someone tries to name what's happening, the pattern has already been running for weeks. What makes this stage particularly disorienting is that nothing has technically stopped. Messages still come. Replies still arrive. But the quality of presence has changed. There's a flatness now, a sense that the other person is participating out of obligation rather than desire. Emotional distance doesn't always look like silence. Sometimes it looks like delayed enthusiasm, like responses that acknowledge but don't engage, like conversations that feel more like check-ins than actual exchanges. The rhythm has shifted, and with it, the emotional weight of each interaction. This is when the first real questions start forming, not accusations, just quiet observations that can't be explained away anymore. Why does it feel harder now? Why does reaching out feel like work? The answers don't come clearly, because the shift itself has been gradual. But something undeniable is happening beneath the surface. The relationship is no longer operating at the same frequency. And once that rhythm breaks, it's not something that repairs itself through hope alone. It requires something neither person has offered yet. The content starts thinning before the frequency does. What used to be full stories, detailed accounts of the day, small observations, things worth sharing, begins to compress into summaries. Busy day. Not much going on. Same as usual. The words still arrive, but they no longer carry texture. This is one of the clearest signs of emotional behavior shifting away from connection. When someone stops offering the details of their life, they're not just being brief, they're quietly withdrawing access. And most of the time, they're doing it without realizing what it signals. Engagement requires energy. It requires the willingness to bring someone into your internal world, to make them feel like they still belong there. When that willingness fades, conversations start to feel transactional. One person shares something specific, and the other responds with something vague. The imbalance becomes obvious. Not hostile, not cold, just absent. Relationship psychology shows us that intimacy isn't built on grand declarations. It's built on small, repeated moments of disclosure. When those moments stop happening, the foundation starts to erode. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. This stage is particularly painful because the other person is still responding. They haven't left. They haven't said anything cruel, but they've stopped letting you in. Attachment patterns reveal themselves most clearly not through what someone says, but through what they stop saying. The shift from, "here's what happened today" to "nothing much" is a form of emotional withdrawal that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. But once you notice it, it's everywhere. In every shortened reply, in every surface-level update, in the growing sense that you're talking to someone who used to be closer. The person on the receiving end often tries to compensate. They ask more questions. They offer more of themselves, hoping it will invite the other person back into the exchange. But behavior analysis tells us that this kind of imbalance doesn't usually correct itself through increased effort. It deepens. Because the issue isn't a lack of prompts, it's a lack of desire to engage. And when that desire fades, No amount of curiosity from the other side will restore it. What's left is a conversation that still exists in form, but has quietly lost its function. At first, the quiet moments felt like interruptions, brief gaps caused by work, distraction, life pulling focus elsewhere. But over time, the silence stops feeling accidental. It begins to show up predictably, after certain topics, at certain times of day, in response to certain kinds of vulnerability. This is when emotional distance moves from circumstantial to structural. The silence isn't happening to the conversation, it's becoming part of it. And once that shift occurs, it's no longer something that can be blamed on timing or bad luck. Patterned silence is one of the most telling forms of communication breakdown. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't apologize. It just returns, again and again, in ways that start to feel deliberate even if they're not. The person creating it may not be consciously choosing withdrawal, but their behavior is consistent enough to form a language of its own. Psychological dynamics operate largely through repetition. When someone repeatedly goes quiet after being asked how they're feeling, or after a moment of emotional exposure, the silence becomes the answer. It says, "I'm not available for this anymore." The one waiting begins to recognize the rhythm. They know when to expect the gap. They start bracing for it. This is where relationship patterns become self-reinforcing. The silence creates distance. The distance creates hesitation. The hesitation creates more silence. Neither person is necessarily trying to hurt the other, but both are now operating within a structure that punishes closeness and rewards retreat. Attachment behaviors begin to mirror what's modeled. If one person withdraws, the other eventually stops reaching. Not out of spite, but out of survival. This is also the stage where hope starts feeling uncomfortable. Because hoping means expecting the pattern to break, and the pattern has been too consistent for too long. Emotional behavior doesn't lie, it doesn't perform. It reveals priority through repetition. And when silence becomes the default response to depth, it's no longer a matter of waiting for things to improve. It's a matter of recognizing what's already been chosen. What comes next isn't reconciliation. It's acknowledgement of what the silence has been saying all along. When one person finally tries to address the growing gap, the response often feels carefully managed. Not dismissive, not cruel, just controlled. The other person doesn't reject the attempt outright. They acknowledge it. They might even agree that things have felt distant. But the follow-through never comes. The conversation smooths over the concern without actually repairing what's underneath. This is where behavior analysis becomes critical. Because what matters isn't whether someone says they want to reconnect. It's whether their actions support that claim. Polite continuity is one of the quieter forms of emotional withdrawal. It allows someone to remain present in title while absent in practice. They respond to the concern. They might even apologize. But nothing about their behavior shifts afterward. The same delays return. The same shallow exchanges resume. The same silence arrives on schedule. Relationship psychology teaches us that words without behavioral change are just maintenance. They keep the structure standing without actually rebuilding it. And over time, the person trying to reconnect learns that bringing it up changes nothing. This creates a specific kind of exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from fighting, but the kind that comes from trying to hold space for someone who's already let go. Attachment patterns show us that people don't always exit cleanly. Sometimes they stay in a relationship while withdrawing their emotional presence. They keep the form intact while letting the function collapse. And because they're still technically there, still responding, still participating, it becomes difficult to name what's actually happening. The distance feels real, but the evidence feels vague. The person seeking closeness begins to question their own perception. Maybe they're being too sensitive. Maybe they're expecting too much. Maybe things really are fine and they're just overthinking it. But psychological dynamics don't operate on reassurance. They operate on pattern. And the pattern here is clear. Effort is being met with politeness, not reciprocity. Vulnerability is being met with acknowledgement, not engagement. What's being offered is just enough to prevent rupture, but not enough to restore connection. And in that gap, something begins to die that no one is willing to name yet. It's not what's said that stands out anymore. It's what doesn't happen afterward. Conversations end without plans to continue them. Questions go unanswered not because they're ignored, but because they're never circled back to. Promises to catch up later dissolve into nothing. This is where emotional behavior reveals its true direction. Follow-up is a form of care. It signals that someone was listening, that they remembered, that the exchange mattered enough to revisit. When follow-up stops, the message is clear. The conversation wasn't prioritized, and neither was the person on the other end of it. This absence creates a specific kind of emotional distance, the kind that's hard to confront because it's built on what didn't occur, not what did. There's no harsh word to point to, no outright rejection, just a growing list of things that were mentioned and never returned to. Plans that were suggested and never solidified. Topics that were started and never finished. Relationship dynamics thrive on continuity. When that continuity breaks down, connection begins to feel conditional. Like it only exists when convenient. Like it requires constant initiation from one side just to keep functioning. The person left without follow-up starts to notice their own behavior changing. They stop sharing things that require a response. They stop asking questions that need follow-through. They begin protecting themselves from the disappointment of watching something they cared about disappear into silence. This is how attachment patterns shift in real time. Not through dramatic breaks, but through learned withdrawal. The absence of follow-up teaches avoidance. It teaches that reaching out doesn't guarantee being reached back for. And over time, that lesson sinks in deeper than any conversation could undo. What makes this stage so isolating is that the other person may not see themselves as withdrawing. They might genuinely believe they're still engaged. But behavior analysis doesn't rely on intention. It relies on outcome. And the outcome here is unmistakable. One person is carrying the entire weight of continuity, while the other has quietly stopped contributing to it. The relationship is still alive in name, but functionally, it's already operating at a distance neither person has agreed to. And that distance is about to become undeniable. The imbalance stops being subtle. One person is clearly doing more, initiating more often, asking more questions, trying harder to keep things moving. The other is responding, but barely. Participating, but passively. They're no longer co-creating the relationship. They're allowing it to exist around them without feeding it. This is where psychological dynamics become starkly visible. Connection isn't something that survives on goodwill alone. It survives on mutual investment. And when that investment becomes one-sided, the structure begins to collapse under its own weight. Asymmetrical effort doesn't always feel like rejection at first. It feels like temporary adjustment, like maybe the other person is going through something and just needs time. But time passes, and the imbalance remains. In fact, it deepens. The person putting in more effort starts to feel it in their body. The exhaustion of being the only one trying, the frustration of unreturned energy, the quiet humiliation of caring more than they're cared for. Relationship psychology is unforgiving in this way. It doesn't reward perseverance, it mirrors investment. And when one side stops investing, the mirror reflects that absence back clearly. This is also the stage where resentment starts to form, even if it's never spoken. The person carrying the weight begins to feel used, not maliciously, but functionally. They feel like they're being kept around without being valued. And the person pulling back may not even realize the imbalance they've created. They might think they're still present, still available, still participating. But emotional behavior doesn't lie. Effort is measurable. Consistency is visible. And the gap between what's being given and what's being returned has grown too wide to ignore. What's most painful about this stage is that it often continues longer than it should. Because the person trying harder keeps hoping that if they just do a little more, the other person will meet them halfway. But behavior analysis shows us that unreciprocated effort doesn't inspire change. It enables stagnation. The relationship survives not because it's healthy, but because one person refuses to let it die. And in that refusal, they slowly lose themselves. What comes next isn't repair, it's recognition of what's already been lost. At some point, the space between them stops feeling wrong. It starts feeling normal. The silence doesn't surprise anymore. The delays don't hurt the same way. The lack of depth doesn't trigger panic. This is one of the most dangerous stages in any relational collapse, not because it's loud, but because it's comfortable. Emotional distance has settled into routine, and both people have quietly adjusted to it. Attachment patterns have shifted. What used to feel like loss now just feels like how things are. This normalization is a form of emotional detachment that happens gradually, beneath awareness. The person who was once fighting for closeness stops fighting. Not because they've given up consciously, but because their nervous system has adapted. They've learned that reaching out doesn't guarantee being met. That vulnerability doesn't guarantee safety. That effort doesn't guarantee reciprocity. So they stop expecting those things. They recalibrate their needs to match what's available. And in doing so, they begin to participate in their own distancing. Relationship dynamics at this stage no longer resemble what they once were. There's still contact, still surface-level exchange, but the emotional core has hollowed out. Both people have learned to coexist at a distance that would have felt unbearable months ago. They've become skilled at not asking for more, at not naming what's missing, at treating the thinning of connection as if it were simply the natural evolution of things. But behavior analysis reveals the truth. This isn't evolution. It's erosion. And the fact that it no longer hurts doesn't mean it isn't happening. The quiet acceptance of distance is often mistaken for healing, but it's not. It's desensitization. The relationship hasn't stabilized. It's flatlined. And while both people may continue moving through the motions, neither is truly present anymore. They've grown used to not being close, used to not being seen, used to existing in parallel rather than together. And because it no longer triggers alarm, it feels sustainable. But sustainability built on emotional numbness isn't connection. It's just a slower form of ending. Eventually, the accumulation of all these small shifts reaches a point where denial stops working, The delays, the shallow responses, the patterned silence, the lack of follow-up, the asymmetry. All of it forms a picture too clear to rationalize away. This isn't a rough patch. This isn't bad timing. This is the relationship operating at a fundamentally different level than it once did. And no amount of hoping or waiting or trying harder will return it to what it was. Psychological dynamics have already rewritten the script. What existed before is gone. This realization doesn't usually arrive dramatically. It comes quietly, often in a moment of mundane clarity, during a delayed response, during another shallow exchange, during the realization that it's been weeks since anything real was shared. The person who's been holding on finally sees the pattern for what it is. Not a series of isolated incidents, but a sustained withdrawal. Emotional behavior doesn't require a breakup to signal the end of intimacy. It signals it through consistent, repeated absence. And once that absence is seen, it can't be unseen. What makes this stage so difficult is that nothing external has changed. The other person is still technically there, still responding, still polite. But the substance is gone. Relationship patterns have shifted so completely that even if both people wanted to repair things, they'd be starting from a place of profound disconnection. The thinning didn't happen overnight, and reversing it wouldn't either. It would require both people to recognize the distance, name it honestly, and actively choose to rebuild. But most of the time, that doesn't happen. Because by now, one person has already emotionally exited, and the other is just beginning to catch up. This is where clarity becomes both a gift and a burden. The truth is finally visible, but so is the loss. The relationship didn't end with a fight or betrayal. It ended through a slow, quiet erosion of presence. Through communication that thinned until there was almost nothing left to hold. And while that kind of ending lacks drama, it doesn't lack pain. It's the pain of realizing that someone chose distance so gradually you didn't notice until you were standing in it alone. And now, all that's left is deciding what to do with that knowledge. The thinning happened. Not because of cruelty, not because of betrayal, but because one person quietly stopped feeding what the other was still trying to hold. Communication became a shell, present in form, absent in function. And once that absence becomes patterned, once the silence feels familiar, once the distance no longer surprises you, the relationship has already ended. It just hasn't been named yet. What you're left with isn't a connection. It's the memory of one, running on autopilot until someone finally has the clarity to stop pretending. This is what emotional withdrawal looks like when it's not dramatic, when it's just consistent, quiet, and undeniable. You don't get closure from someone who never left loudly. You get it by recognizing the pattern yourself, by seeing that the investment became one-sided, that the depth disappeared, that the person you're still talking to stopped being present months ago. Behavior doesn't lie. It just repeats itself until you're ready to believe what it's been showing you all along. The hardest part isn't accepting that it's over. It's accepting that it's been over. That you've been holding on to something that was already gone. But now you know. And knowing is the only place real movement begins. If this resonated, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because understanding the patterns is how you stop repeating them. And if you're still trying to make sense of why the absence hurt more than anything they actually said or did, if you're wondering why the space they left behind feels heavier than the relationship itself, you need to watch the previous video. It's called Why Absence Hurts More Than the Breakup Itself, because what you just saw here is the slow thinning. But that video, that's where you'll understand why the emptiness stayed long after they stopped responding. Why your nervous system is still reacting to someone who's no longer there. Why silence became the loudest thing in the room. Don't skip it. That's where the psychology gets even clearer. That's where the pattern completes itself. Go watch it now. The link is right there. You'll see exactly why this hurt the way it did.